Welcome to the Infinite Women podcast. I'm your host, Allison Tyra, and today I'm joined by Lauren Jae Gutterman, chair of the American Studies Department at the University of Texas at Austin, and author of Her Neighbor's Wife, A History of Lesbian Desire Within Marriage. So first, can you just introduce us to the premise of your book?
So the book is about women who were married to men, but experienced same-sex desires. Some of them, were able to act on those desires, some were not. And it traces these women as a kind of group in their experiences from the immediate post-World War II period, roughly to the present. And it also traces the kind of changing ways these women are talked about in popular culture, in psychoanalytic texts, and also the kind of ways that these women and debates around them changed among kind of lesbian activist groups.
Now, I do just want to clarify because the title obviously says lesbian. So are we using this as an adjective to describe attraction between two female identifying individuals, or are there also women in this book who likely would have identified as bisexual or pansexual or otherwise today? Because I know there's a lot of concern around bi erasure, and there's a big desire in queer communities to find themselves in history, but that can come at the expense of other members of the queer community.
Absolutely. Many of these women were, in terms of their sexual activity, bisexual, but in terms of their identities, um, it was a minority who identified as bisexual. And there are various reasons for that, which I trace throughout the book. But the other part of it is kind of aside from questions of identity, the majority of the women that I found were not saying, I'm deeply attracted to men, I'm deeply attracted to women. My sexual desires don't fit into kind of one category easily. Some women said that, but not many. What most of them were saying was, I got married because it was what was expected of me. And many of them said like they didn't understand what kind of like sexual pleasure was until they, had a sexual experience with another woman. I don't in the book ascribe an identity label to anyone. I follow how they talked about themselves. And so kind of thinking about how to talk about these women was often a challenge. And I think the word I use most often is wives, because that's the one thing that really connects them.
And I think it's also an issue where because language evolves and our understanding of, different aspects of humanity changes over time, there are people where we don't know how they would have described themselves because we don't have the documentation, which obviously your book is very much about the documentation we do have. And I'd like to ask more about that in a minute. But I think it's that issue of unless we have something like the Diary of Ann Lister, we can't definitively say this is how someone viewed themselves and their lives.
Yeah, I mean, what we can do is trace how these kind of terms and the language that we have, to describe sexual identity or behavior changes over time. And so, that's one of the things I trace in the book is how, in the immediate post-World War II period, the kind of major or dominant opinion among psychoanalysts was that kind of bisexual was a specious identity category, and that this wasn't really real, and people who are identifying as bisexual were really gay. They often talked about lesbian desire as something that was like a problem, an inclination that many women had and had to overcome. So they didn't necessarily see, same-sex desires or even same-sex experiences as fully kind of undermining a woman's identity as heterosexual or in their terms, her kind of normalcy, sexual normalcy, right? They believe that those desires were something that a woman could kind of overcome or cure herself of. And then the other part of that I trace in kind of the second half of the book after kind of the emergence of gay liberation and lesbian feminism is that there is this moment in the 1970s of a kind of bisexual chic, and bisexuality gets talked about in the mainstream media, becomes much more visible really than ever before. But at the same time, the kind of lesbian communities that many of these women were a part of were really negative about bisexuality. And so even women who might have felt that that was an appealing identity label for themselves, or felt that it best described their experiences, often felt kind of pressure to identify as a lesbian instead, because bisexuality was seen as a cop-out among many lesbian feminist kind of communities.
It is striking how any marginalized community will always further marginalize members of their own community, like hopefully not as a whole, but we saw this with, I mean, in the feminist movements, it's been, white suffragists trying to exclude black suffragists, and then we've got in the 60s and 70s, like Betty Friedan was a massive homophobe, and today it's the TERFs, right, with the trans exclusionary so-called feminists. I don't
Mhm.
think they deserve to be called feminists, personally.
Mhm.
It's deeply messed up, obviously. But one of the things that's interesting about the perspective you're taking in this book is that someone like Betty Friedan was very much talking about like marriage and the housewife and all of that. You argue that marriage, unlike many other aspects of American life, actually offered more flexibility for queerness than an area like, say, employment. So, what's the argument there?
What I'm trying to show is that, first of all, maybe trying to challenge is this idea that women, especially in the post-war period, especially if they were married, and lived in the suburbs and kind of fulfilled that kind of quintessential post-war suburban housewife stereotype, that there was just no way they could have acted on same-sex desires. And this is coming out of a lot of LGBTQ history, that has focused on queer communities and public spaces. And many scholars, have documented and drawn attention to the fact that many men who participated in public sex cultures and visited gay bars were married, right? And we know that because many of them were arrested. And so there's been this kind of assumption that, well, married women, just it simply couldn't have done that. It just wasn't possible. And so one of the kind of goals of the book is to show, well, actually, it was possible. But it was possible because they acted on their same-sex desires in different ways. And so most of these women did not kind of meet same-sex lovers in public places in terms of like gay bars or restaurants or kind of other kind of queer community places, but rather their sexual relationships with other women tended to unfold with women they met in the course of their daily lives, often women who were wives and mothers themselves. So it was not at all uncommon for two married women who had kids of the same ages to become friends, socialize with their husbands and together and socialize with their kids. And then a romantic and sexual relationship evolved from that. And so that's one of the kind of goals of the book. And then the other thing that I think is important, or that I wanted to draw attention to, is that a lot of the husbands in this book, it's not always clear how much they knew in terms of their wives' relationships, sexual or romantic relationships with other women. But there are enough examples of men who did clearly know, but chose not to talk about it or not to confront their wives about it because they hoped it would pass, especially in the immediate post-war period when it would have been very, very difficult for these women to get divorced, to identify publicly as a lesbian, to raise kids outside of marriage. Many men didn't really feel that threatened by it or thought it would pass. And so there is this kind of flexibility then especially in that immediate post-war period when divorce is really stigmatized, homosexuality is really stigmatized, women don't have the kind of earning potential that they have later, that there is this kind of flexibility or queerness within marriage, and that there's space. Husbands, in some cases, actively kind of made space for their wives to act on these same-sex desires and pursue same-sex relationships because they didn't necessarily see them as threatening. There's also a way that many of the husbands in the book, too, were having their own kind of extramarital relationships. And so it was a kind of flexibility in the institution that went both ways, right? It wasn't only for women.
Now, are any of the situations that you look at cases of lavender marriages where you had two same-sex attracted people of opposite genders marrying basically as protection, as, you know, a way to get their families off their backs and not to raise suspicions, but they both go into that situation knowing this is the deal?
Yeah, there were a few examples of that, and they varied. In some cases, it was to people who felt like, they maybe had identified as gay or had had really important same-sex sexual relationships, but felt like they wanted to do their best and try and put it behind them and kind of live a quote unquote normal life and start a family together. And then there were other examples in which men and women did this, as more of a cover, in which they didn't have an expectation that they would be living in the way we might expect or assume a husband and wife live together. That it was more of a kind of pretense. I'm thinking back now, but I don't think any of those relationships ended really well, or at least those are the ones that stick out in my mind. And some of that had to do with women who found that even when they had entered into a kind quote unquote lavender marriage with a gay man, that they were kind of surprised to find that the man still had these expectations of them that they would behave as a wife. So there was one woman I'm thinking of who married a man in San Francisco. They were both gay. And she then was like really surprised when he was bringing all these gay friends to their house and expecting her to like feed them and clean up after them and keep the fridge stocked. And she was like, I've had enough of this. And then there was another example that was in Texas, and this couple had kind of agreed to a kind of cover marriage. And then the wife realized that the husband really took advantage of her financially because of the ways that marriage legally provides men access to their wives' finances, and property. And so that was another case in which a kind of cover marriage really didn't end up very well.
I think that's getting back to that whole question of even in marginalized communities, the more privileged members of the community will often take advantage of or undermine or exclude the less privileged. Like they're both queer, but the man has all of these legal powers in that situation that the woman doesn't.
Absolutely. And that's a way that even people who enter a marriage with these kind of alternative ideas about it find that the kind of structures of the law, are certainly giving men greater power and privilege than women.
I think it's also speaking to, in multiple ways, the changing expectations, like as we gain more rights as women, as queer people, as queer women, um, gaining more rights means that we expect more for ourselves and from those around us. So, you know, the fact that legally, hopefully, that guy couldn't have taken advantage of his wife financially. A woman has more ability today to stand up and say, no, you can entertain your own friends. That's not my job. I'm not doing your unpaid labor. But also, when you were saying the men didn't see their wives' extramarital affairs as threats, that idea that it's less valid if you're having a relationship of someone with the opposite sex, and those ideas that we were talking
Mhm.
about around bisexuality.
Mhm.
A lot of your book does seem to speak to this evolution because you're going from the 50s to roughly modern day, and looking at that evolution. and how we are able to expect more and expect better. Not that we always get it, but it has changed. So you chose to start the book with this archetype of the idealized womanhood in 1950s. So Barbara Kalish is, a wife, mother, lives in the suburbs, and she falls in love with another PTA mom. So, what is it about this juxtaposition of that heteronormative nuclear family as sort of the core of what a lot of people see as this is America, this is vital, this is our foundation, and then juxtaposing that with, yeah, but a lot of those ladies were doing things that you would be scandalized by in that time.
Yeah, I think, part of my goal with the book is to say, this kind of period that is so idealized, and talked about as a kind of moment when marriage was the strongest, when husbands and wives relationships were better, or, divorce rates were lower. I mean, depending, I think how you see this period often depends on kind of your political perspective, but is still very much celebrated. And I think my goal was to say, that this moment of a kind of that many people see as a golden age of marriage was not what you think it was, and that it was actually much more complicated underneath the surface, and that this institution that we also think about as the kind of marking the epitome of heterosexuality, that there was actually a lot of space within it for husbands and wives to act in non-normative ways, or ways, that were stigmatized or not socially acceptable if they had happened more publicly.
And so then, as we've mentioned, you track this evolution of attitudes and institutions through the subsequent decades. So can you give us a short history of how things changed from the 1950s roughly to today?
Sure. I mean, so the big thing the well, there's kind of multiple revolutions, right? One is around the kind of feminist emergence of the feminist movement, emergence of lesbian feminism, emergence of gay liberation, and a new kind of pressure among gay and lesbian activists to come out publicly as a first step in attempting to politically transform society and to challenge homophobic attitudes. And this was really a change from the post-World War II period, when a lot of lesbian activists were pretty sympathetic to married women who experienced same-sex desires, and pretty understanding of the kind of challenges and the forces that had kind of pushed them into marriage, and the reasons that they might not be able to leave easily. And that really shifts in the 1970s with this new kind of pressure to come out publicly, and a new criticism among gay and lesbian activists of, people that they see as closeted. And especially those, right, who are in what appear to be straight marriages and are kind of having those benefits of public heterosexuality while behaving much differently, beneath the surface or in private. And so there becomes in the 1970s this new pressure on many of the women, that I'm talking about, a new pressure to come out publicly, to tell their husbands explicitly, how they feel, what's going on with other women, and to end their marriages. And of course, this is also then made possible because of, shifts in attitudes and laws governing divorce at the same time. So, between the late 1960s and the early 1980s, the divorce rate shoots up. No fault divorce that is not based on proving one partner, failed as a spouse, becomes possible in many states. And so divorce becomes much more accessible and possible to think about. for many women who hadn't considered it before. Um, and so I had kind of, when I was starting this project, thought of it as a kind of simpler story of kind of from repression to liberation, but what I uncovered was a lot of really mixed feelings, sad feelings, upsetness, feelings of kind of pressure, among many women, especially mothers in the 1970s and 80s who felt like they had to make this impossible choice. And in many cases, identifying publicly as a lesbian or as a bisexual woman and trying to divorce and leave your husband meant that you might have lost custody of your children. And so this made the kind of pressure to leave and to come out publicly um, really very emotionally difficult and a very fraught decision for many of the women whose stories I trace. And kind of moving on then beyond that period, thinking about up to the present, I think another kind of big shift is that we've seen is there became in the kind of 1990s and early 2000s a kind of self-help literature that emerged for women who were referred to by various terms. Married women who love women, wives who love women, lesbian or bisexual married women. And a lot of those kind of self-help books encouraged women who were in this situation not to feel pressure to label their identities, and encourage them to kind of also to kind of reassure them that this didn't necessarily mean that they had to get divorced, and to let them know that there were kind of many ways that women found of kind of balancing relationships, existing relationships with husbands, and kind of finding space for same-sex lovers, or relationships. And so that is yet kind of another change that I talk about in really the epilogue of the book.
So do you think that things like polycules, for example, that we're
Hmm.
seeing
Hmm.
amongst the youth,
Hmm.
I say for my geriatric age of 35, but there does seem to be a lot more openness to non-heteronormative ways of being in committed relationships, like depending on what that commitment means for you, and as long as everybody is in agreement on what's going on and what the boundaries are and all of that. Do you think that that's sort of the next phase that we're going to see of what marriage looks like?
I think absolutely, like marriage continues to evolve and to change. And I mean, something that is different, between kind of contemporary polyamory and most of the relationships that I chart in the book is that, most of those people entered marriage with kind of conventional expectations of what it would look like and how they would arrange their, intimate lives. Um, and today there's just many possibilities, many more possibilities that people can think about for ways to think about organizing their families and the ones that they love and the people they're sexually attracted to, right? And so it's not only that like it could be, a kind of group of people who are, in an intimate relationship with each other, but it could also be people who, are choosing to marry friends, that they don't have a romantic or sexual feelings for, but want to build a life with that person, want that person to be their partner, and for that kind of life partner to be different than the person that they're having sex with or that they're in a romantic relationship with. Um, and I would also just kind of, I think, as I was saying, marriage continues to change and evolve. And I don't think that, any of these models are necessarily like liberatory, right? I think that marriage just continues to change. And some people have pointed out that the new kind of desire for polyamorous relationships today could also be a kind of response to the the difficulty of affording a household, and all the kind of tasks of like raising a family or just kind of getting by financially at this very difficult moment. So it can be a way of kind of sharing kind of the financial burden and caretaking labor.
I saw a movie many years ago. I forget the title, but it was basically talking about this premise that people, particularly men, cheat because you can only get at most 80% of what you need from another person, right? You're never going to get everything you need from a single other person. And so in the context of the movie, they were talking about a guy who basically lost his 80%, his wife, because he was chasing a 20%, cheating. And so he sacrificed 80 for 20 and how stupid that was. And so, but when we're talking about, I would say being evolved enough to understand that you can have your net needs met in different ways by different people. Again, as long as everything is consensual and you all have your boundaries agreed upon and all of that. But that understanding that you don't have to rely on a single person to meet all of your needs, I think, at least for me, I think is very important in a marriage. I am married,
Mhm.
for what it's worth.
Mhm. Mhm.
But yes, I find that very interesting. And I kind of think that speaks to, what we're talking about here is these women needed things that they were not getting in their marriage. But I did also want to talk about going back to that question of documentation, because I know that the more marginalized a person is, the less likely her documentation survives. So this is a bigger issue with, I mean, women's history as a whole, but when we're talking about queer history and any letters or diaries that you were fortunate to be able to access, we've talked about these are the risks that these women would have been facing if they had kids. They could have lost their kids, all of these things. If they had a job, they could have lost their job, etc. But one of the things that I saw that your book has been praised for is that you have made a concerted effort to include women of color because it is so easy to just default to that white history reflecting all history. But I'm assuming this was more difficult to find those kinds of documentation because we are adding that extra layer of racial marginalization.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's also about kind of the first wave of gay and lesbian oral history collecting projects and gay and lesbian archives, were, disproportionately collecting the stories and materials of white gay and lesbian people. And so they're definitely, it's definitely harder to get at the experiences of queer women of color in this period. There were various ways that I tried to do that, and also to try and highlight the stories of queer women of color that I did have access to, because there were so many, there were so many women's stories that I just had to cut from the book because wasn't enough space. Um, and one thing I think that is important that I saw was that regardless of kind of race or class, these women did kind of tend to find lovers in the context of their daily lives. Certainly, working class women were more likely to go to gay bars than upper middle class women. But for most of them, because of the time constraints of caring for young kids, as most of them were, the time constraints of household labor, in addition to paid labor outside the home or not. They just didn't have the same kind of geographic mobility or kind of free time that their male counterparts did. And so all of these women, at least, until the 1970s when things began to change and more kind of lesbian spaces emerged, um, their relationships tended to unfold with other wives and mothers in their neighborhood, women they met at work, women they met at church, women in their social circles. And we might then think about this kind of access to the queerness or flexibility of marriage, that kind of space and protection that it provided for women who experienced same-sex desires, was something that white women had then greater access to than women of color.
And so when we're looking at the US today, it's a very scary time for a lot of people. And with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, proving that rights, we thought we had, can be taken away. A lot of people are worried about what an unchecked Republican-controlled government will do to marriage equality, as well as no-fault divorce, which you've explained, how that was revolutionary, in this process of evolving queer women's rights and ability to live how they choose. So that conservative need to control marriage as sacred to their idea of what America is or should be is still very much present all of these decades later.
What I think many conservatives want today isn't necessarily the end of gay sex, but it is making queer people less publicly visible, and reordering or reasserting the privilege that heterosexual and married people have in society. And so there's lots of examples of this, right? So that at one of the Republican National Conventions, right, Grindr usage went up tremendously, of the Grindr app for men seeking sex with other men, or an example of one of the moms of who was co-founder of Moms for Liberty, and her husband is really active in the Republican Party. I think this is in Florida, and that, they were regularly having sexual relationship with a third partner, a woman. And so I think there's ways that there's a hypocrisy, right? That we can trace in these ways, that some people will advocate publicly for a kind of return to marriages of the post-World War II period, but behind closed doors will do something much different.
So it sounds like it's very much a question, both then and now, of we want the appearance that everything is the way we think it should be, even if, as you said, there is hypocrisy behind closed doors.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think it's about power, right? And really trying to push queer people and trans people back, in the closet, to take away the power and the kind of civil rights achievements that they have made, and to you know return to a time when they were less powerful, and when open discrimination against queer people and trans people and gender nonconforming people was acceptable, and that then people who outwardly conform to normative ideas about gender and sexuality are then rewarded with greater power in society.
How much of this focus on marriage do you think is about controlling women specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in this country, the kind of reassertion of patriarchal power, that is a part of Christian nationalism, is very much about reasserting men's power over women in various ways, right? Through marriage, but not exclusively through marriage.
In terms of what people can be doing on an activism front, because I mean, the really scary thing is that the Republicans control all three branches of government, right? And to me, that raises the question of who is going to check their power, because from an institutional standpoint, it doesn't look like there is anyone to check that
Hmm.
power.
Hmm.
And so I guess from an activism standpoint, what can everyone be doing to try and protect themselves, protect their neighbors, protect their families? Is there anything from your perspective that we can do in this time?
Um, I mean, I think a couple of things come to mind. Certainly, I don't have all the answers. One thing I think is to resist the urge to hide or to become less visibly queer, because that actually puts LGBTQ people at greater risk. Um, and especially people whose queerness is visible, right? And recognizable and can't be hidden. So that's one thing, is to reject that kind of urge to hide or to be quiet in your queerness. Um, and to continue speaking out and being publicly visible. And another thing I think is just to acknowledge in this moment in the United States that trans people are really at greatest risk. So I live in Texas. The Texas legislature only meets every other year. The next session begins in January 2025. Hasn't even started already. More than 30 anti-trans bills have been filed. And these bills, span everything from, creating greater punishments for parents who affirm their children's gender identities to legislating what bathrooms people can use, and even kind of calling for physical and chromosomal tests of university athletes. So I think we really need to recognize that trans people are facing the brunt of the hatred in this moment, and also to really reject and challenge and criticize Democrats who have been arguing after Trump's election that they can't support trans people, that that's going too far. That's why that they've lost so much ground politically. And so I think we really can't let that go, or can't let that be acceptable.
Join us next time on the Infinite Women podcast, and remember, well behaved women rarely make history.